So, hello, my name is Dan Snow. I'm a senior data scientist for the Cook County Assessor's Office. And today I'm going to be talking about a project that our office has spent probably the past 6 to 8 months working on. That project is the second generation of our residential valuation pipeline. And I'll talk more about what that means in a minute. If you've attended CHI-HAC Nights previous, you may have seen the first iteration of this pipeline. This is the new and improved version. So if you are not familiar with the assessor's office, our job is basically to estimate the price if a property were to sell of every single property in Cook County. And we do that so that properties can be taxed, right? The property taxes are divided based on the estimated value of homes. How do we actually do that? Well, we use sales. We basically collect sales. We use them as training data for a machine learning model. And then we estimate homes, the sale price of homes that have not sold. This process does not happen all at once. So the entire county is not all assessed at the same time. Cook County is a little bit strange. It's actually divided into 3 different parts called triads. And each triad is reassessed every 3 years. So your assessed value of your home will only change really every 3 years. This year, 2021, the city triad is the one that is being reassessed. And so mostly when I'm talking about the model today, I'm going to be talking about the city. What do I actually mean when I keep talking about the model? So as I mentioned before, the assessor's job is to estimate property values. We do that with basically a giant predictive machine learning model. And the scope of the model that I'm talking about today only includes residential properties. And that includes single family homes, multifamily apartments up to a certain number of units, and special properties like bed and breakfasts and things like that. In total, there are around 1.1 million of those in Cook County, but only a portion of those will be reassessed for the city. So in 2018, during the last reassessment and prior to the current administration, the modeling results were not so hot. So assessments are generally graded on the following criteria: accuracy, uniformity, and vertical equity. I'll mostly talk about accuracy and uniformity today. The main stats that you need to pay attention to are ratio, which is the ratio of basically the estimated value to the sale price if a property has a sale, and COD, which is the coefficient of dispersion. It's one of the more important stats that we look at. It's basically a measure of variance. And the target range for COD is 5 to 15. In 2018, during the last reassessment, according to the CCA, which is the Civic Consulting Alliance, the COD was 30. So basically twice the accepted standard. These standards, by the way, are set by the International Assessing, the IAAO, International Assessing Officers Organization, something like that. And they're generally sort of accepted across the field. Certain areas have been especially difficult to model in the past. So Hyde Park is one of those. And when I'm talking about Hyde Park, a lot of you are probably familiar with the neighborhood. In this case, I'm referring to the township, or the city town, which is the area outlined in black. It spans a really large portion of the south side. Hyde Park, the neighborhood, is right here. But as you can see, right, it goes all the way down to Calumet and covers a really large portion of South Chicago. And this area is just difficult to model because it has a lot of heterogeneity both in terms of the housing stock and in terms of the sale prices. So you can get properties in this area that sell for millions of dollars, in and around Kenwood or Hyde Park, all the way down to $20,000 in other areas. So it's just really hard to accurately value this area. And in 2018, the last time the city was reassessed, again, according to the CCA, the COD for Hyde Park specifically was 72. So very significantly higher than the accepted standard of 15. So we have an opportunity, right? Knowing that the modeling was subpar in the past, we have the chance to build something better. And we started doing that with V1 of the RES pipeline. I'll talk a little bit about that. But really, we have an even bigger opportunity to improve this year with the city. And what does that improvement actually look like? So what constitutes better? How are we measuring it? Better compared to the models that I just showed you. So those CODs and ratios from previous years. And then also better compared to the sort of industry standard accepted model. Typically, assessors' offices just use linear models. We think we can beat a linear model. And then better as measured by, again, those assessment-specific performance statistics like ratio and COD, and also adherence to some sort of project and organizational values, which I'll talk about in a minute. So did we do better? We did. So again, here are the CCA 2018 city assessment results on the left. And here are our sort of estimated first run model results on the right. So as you can see, we've moved toward the standards in all of these statistics. In some cases, we've seen pretty huge changes. COD especially is a big one. And although we're not yet quite meeting the standard, there's still some room for improvement. And we'll talk about the challenges we face and exactly why that is. So that's the city. Broken out by township, you can see that we've improved and sort of met more stats township by township than we did in 2018. Again, big improvement. I especially want to point out Hyde Park here. So here was that 72 from before. We've basically cut that in half, down to 35. So huge improvement. We're really proud of that. Same thing for Lake and West Chicago, which have similar problems to Hyde Park. So that's sort of versus the past. What about versus the industry standard? So here, I'm sort of showing my hand a little bit, but compared to a normal linear model, which is on the top here, this is the performance of our new and improved nonlinear model. And as you can see, we use light GBM. I'll talk about that specifically later, but performance is better. For you machine learning wonks, these are the sort of top line stats that you'd be interested in. So that's our approach and sort of what we accomplished. How did we do it? Well, we did it by adherence to our values and sort of incremental improvement. As I said, you've seen V1 before, potentially. This is V2. And these are the sort of values that we wanted to keep while we were working on this project. Fairness and transparency are just broad values of the office, but obviously are also shared by this project. We want to assess accurately across the entire county. We also want to be transparent about what we're doing. That means open sourcing the code. It's already open source and available on GitLab, and sharing our results like we are right now. These other values are a little bit more technical, but basically we want to build a system that is more resilient and flexible. The old system that we had prior to the current administration and even V1 was a little bit brittle. It was prone to breaking with bad data or new requirements needed. And so we wanted to change that for V2. And we did that by sort of taking a very incremental approach. So I'm going to talk about what we had in the past and where we are now. Basically, prior to 2019, prior to the current administration, we were using SPSS and just basic linear models to do all the valuations. There were 50,000 some lines of code. It was very difficult to parse. The code was not open source. You couldn't go and look at it. And it was just really difficult to use. There were only a few people internally that knew how to actually work the model. So in 2019, we improved that with V1 of this valuation pipeline. We transitioned over to R, significantly shrunk the size of the code base. We started dabbling in nonlinear models, and we open sourced our code. It was all available on GitLab from that point. But there were still some issues with this. As I said, it was a little bit brittle and difficult to use. There's also no dependency management, so it was difficult to replicate fully. We have sort of solved that, or mostly solved that, in the most recent version. So in this most recent pipeline, which is V2, we're still in the R universe, but we've transitioned to using just tidyverse and tidy models. I'll talk more about what those actually are in a minute. We've also transitioned to using LightGBM, which is a nonlinear model, and still have open source code, but also have better dependency management and some real-time prediction thrown in to boot. So those are sort of abstractions. What does this look like concretely? So here's what the SPSS code looked like in the era prior to 2019. It was basically tens of thousands of lines of just this. And I don't know about you, this is not especially readable to me. I think this is doing something with neighborhoods. I don't know SPSS. But so for V1, we transitioned to something a little better. This is all R. It's definitely more readable and understandable than the code on the left, but it's still a little syntactically difficult to read. There are a lot of loops and ifs involved, which again made it a little bit brittle. So that was the past, and this is now. So now we have fully transitioned to using tidy models, and the code on the right is the latest code, basically. This is all of the code that is required to run just a linear model on our already pre-processed data. Very simple, straightforward. Tidy models really abstracts away a lot of the difficulty and complexity of the code on the left. You just end up with the code on the right. So if we weren't already in the weeds enough, I talked a little bit about how we did it, the incremental approach. Now I'm going to talk about what exactly we did. So we made a new model. We transitioned to tidy models, and we selected LightGBM. Those are all really big and important choices. So model selection, parameter selection, feature selection, all of those are choices. And I'm going to sort of walk through each one of those step by step and sort of try to explain our thought process for making that choice. So as I mentioned before, we're using LightGBM. For those not familiar, LightGBM is a machine learning framework. It's a boosted tree framework, pretty similar to XGBoost if you've ever dabbled in that. It just absolutely blows every other model that we tested out of the water. We tested a lot of others, regularized linear models, random forest. We tested XGBoost, even neural networks. LightGBM just absolutely outperforms all of them. It's just way more accurate. It also has other advantages. It's really fast to train. Using some pretty complicated cross-validation, it takes less than 24 hours to train the whole thing on a pretty large data set, and less than 10 minutes to train once it is actually cross-validated. The other big advantage for us is just it's really well documented, and it's widely used in sort of housing specific prediction models. So there are lots of like examples and documentation for how exactly it works. But LightGBM to me is not the main story here. To me, the main story is tidy models. So tidy models was the thing that let us shrink our code base from 12,000 lines of R to 1,000 lines of R. It really handles a lot of the very, very difficult ML logic and helps you avoid a lot of pitfalls like data leakage and things like that. It just completely abstracts all that stuff away. So this was really, really great for us. The main benefit here is just that there's less complexity in the code base, and we can just rapidly iterate and add new features to the model now. It's very easy. So that's sort of the model design structure, the model that we chose. What about the data? So if you're in the machine learning space, you probably know for supervised learning tasks, like most predictive models, you have to have training data. And our training data is the 7 years prior to the assessment. So for the 2021 assessment, we'll use sales all the way back to 2013. This is our sort of test, train, validate split. We're basically holding out the most recent 10% of sales as a test set because we want the model to perform well on the most recent sales. And then when we actually estimate values, so when we make the assessed values for 2021, we will train on the full sales sample because we want those latest sales in there in case there are any weird trends in that latest period. So that's the sort of sample that we used. What features actually go into the model? Here is a non-exhaustive list. Mostly it's things that you would expect: age, the attic characteristics, number of fireplaces, but also geospatial stuff like whether or not you're in a floodplain, proximity to major roads, highways, things like that, school districts and attendance zones in the case of CPS. Then also time factors like seasonality and some economic stuff like median income of the tract that your property is located in. The ones in green are new features. Again, this is not exhaustive. There are some other new ones, but these are the big important ones. Which features are actually important in the model? LightGBM is convenient because it has built-in sort of feature importance and contribution methods. So here we can see the overall feature importance of the model. Basically, it's what you would expect, which is good. The location factors on the very top are the things that are most important. That's neighborhood, school district, things like that. And then median income, building square footage, and then some time factors. So this is a good gut check for us. It's not like super rigorous, but it does show that the model sort of conforms to what you would expect to be important. We get asked a lot about what is and is not in the model. So these are some of the features that are not in the model that get asked about quite a bit. Property condition is a big one, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. It is tracked in our data, but it's not tracked particularly well. I think the last time I checked, 99% of the values for condition were the same thing. And so it's not very useful in a predictive model if there's no variance in the attribute that you're trying to predict on, or predict with, rather. We also tested crime. Crime is a good predictor, but also highly correlated with things that are already in the model, like median income. And so it doesn't really add that much predictive power. And it's just a ton of work to aggregate. The city of Chicago makes crime stats pretty easily available, but we need to aggregate for the full county. And so doing that every single year, doing it consistently can be a little bit difficult. It's just, it's not worth the performance gain to add crime. The other big missing one is interior characteristics. So our office just does not track things like kitchen quality, amenities, wood floors, all the stuff that could add value to a home. We do not observe. We cannot see it. And so they are not in the model. That means that most of a home's value is determined by location, time of sale, and then the sort of broad set of characteristics like square footage, number of rooms, things like that. We do have plans for some future features. So things like distance to amenities. Obviously, if you live in the city, proximity to a CTA stop is like a pretty big driver of value. A lot of that is already captured by things like neighborhood effects, but in the future, we plan to add specific features for things like that. We also take requests. We can't know about every single feature that would drive value, and sometimes taxpayers have good intuition about what those might be. So we received an email from a taxpayer asking about unincorporated areas. And as a result of that email, we now have a GitLab issue, and eventually unincorporated areas will be included in the model. They won't be included in the 2021 model because there are no unincorporated areas in the city, but eventually they will be included. So there are other sort of model decision-making or important parts of the model. After we make the initial modeled values, we do what's called post-modeling adjustment, which is basically trying to correct bias in the error structure of the model. So if our predictions are very off at the high or the low end, we'll basically shift the entire distribution of ratios toward 1. And again, 1 is the target ratio for estimation. That's the estimated value divided by the sale price. So we want it to be equal to 1. For properties with recent sales, we'll also cap the ratio. So if the ratio is 3 or something absurdly high, we will just set it to 2. There aren't very many ratios that actually fall outside of those bounds in most places. And then also, we take steps to ensure that exactly identical properties have exactly identical values. So for things like townhomes, where they're basically all the same unit, we want to ensure that they have exactly the same value. And then finally, there are some things with exemptions that are very complicated. I'm going to gloss over this. So that's what we did very specifically. How did we do in relation to those values that I mentioned earlier? I think we did quite well. So fairness, we're using LightGBM and we have better data handling. So we have increased accuracy. Transparency, we've vastly simplified the code base. It's much, much more accessible now. And again, it's all open source on GitLab. The link will be later in this presentation, and I'll put it in the chat as well. Also, flexibility, resiliency. As I said before, tidy models really enables that stuff. Before, if you had missing data, things like that, it was really difficult to sort of handle it in base R. Tidy models has functions and stuff built in to do all that handling. We don't have to really worry about it. And then, as I mentioned before, the sort of portability and usability of the old code base was problematic. It was difficult to replicate just because it didn't have hard version numbers and such. And also it was difficult to aggregate the data. Here we're using Renv. If you're familiar with Python, you have a lock file. It's basically the same thing as that. We've locked all the dependencies, and we will make all of the data open that is needed to replicate the model. So that's what we've done. We've done a lot. We've improved significantly from before, but there are still opportunities for improvement, even in modeling. But the biggest bang for our buck at this point comes not from improvements in modeling, but from improvements in data quality. So really, models are only as good as their data, and our data can be really problematic. As I mentioned before, we just don't have property characteristics for things like interior characteristics, kitchens, pools, stuff like that. Condition is an especially big one, and I'll show you an example in just a minute. We also just have inaccurate characteristics in our system. So the system that we use is kind of antiquated. It's really complicated. The historical data is just really, really messy and difficult to work with. Again, I'll show you an example of this. And then occasionally we have non-arm's length sales. Arm's length, kind of a term of art in the real estate market. It basically means that the sale was between two parties that, you know, maybe are related, like family members or something like that. But we don't have a strict way to identify those sales. And so they can end up in the training set and end up biasing the model. So what do those look like in concrete terms? So here are two different properties. They have essentially the same set of characteristics. This is what we actually observe in the data, right? This is what I see as a data scientist when I'm trying to build the model. They're very close to each other, nearly identical, but if we actually go and look at them, this is what they look like, right? So the property on the left, boarded up, probably no one lives there. Condition is rather poor. Property on the right looks fairly well maintained, might have an addition even. You know, these are the same year. They're also quite close together, but there is no way in our data to distinguish between these two properties. So this is a huge problem for us. We really need condition or some similar attribute. We also lack characteristics on the same property. So this is actually the same property just over time, right? The picture on the left is from 2015. The picture on the right is from 2019. And you can see that they've done a wholesale renovation of this place, right? The siding has even changed on this property. And it sold in 2017 for $50,000. We valued it, it was, you know, reasonably close. And now it's sold for $300-some thousand, and we're way, way off, right? But in our data, no characteristics have changed because we just aren't tracking things that would map onto the properties or the characteristics of this property that have actually changed, right? No interior characteristics, no siding quality, things like that. So this is a huge problem. As I mentioned before, we also just have really inaccurate characteristics. So this is, again, same property. Picture on the left is 2015, picture on the right, 2019. Our data currently shows that the property on the right is a 2-bedroom place, 1,000 square feet, and 97 years old. It might be the same property, but it definitely does not have 2 bedrooms anymore. We just didn't get the updated characteristics of this property, and that'll be reflected in the estimated value. We also get lots and lots of non-arm's length sales. Again, we don't have a way to distinguish them, but you can sort of gut check the really bad ones. So here on the left, model says that this property, which is a 3-story gray stone in Ukrainian Village, is around $1.2 million. It was actually sold in 2020 for $174,000. Probably not an arm's length sale. Same thing on the right, around, you know, $580,000 predicted value, but sold for $112,000. Again, probably not an arm's length sale, but we need a way to effectively exclude these from our training set in order to train the model effectively. We've started doing that via sort of manual sales validation. So those are the sort of individual characteristic problems. There are also just sort of broadly difficult to assess areas. So areas that have really high housing heterogeneity. I mentioned Hyde Park before. Oak Park is another big example. So here, right, downtown Oak Park is within this, this rectangle. You can see up to the left, There are properties here with $1 to $2 million sale prices. And then a few blocks to the east, we just go to $100,000 and less. And this gradient is really, really difficult to model and capture. It's this really small geographic area. Again, we don't have a lot of characteristics to distinguish between these properties. And so this has been historically difficult to model and is still difficult to model. We also just have poorer performance in certain areas due to a sort of like low base effect. So ratios are calculated as such. So if you have a $45,000 sale in somewhere like Hyde Park, if we have a $45,000 estimated value and a $40,000 sale, we get a ratio of 1.13, which is well outside the sort of standard range. But if we have an absolute difference of $5,000 here with a much higher sale price, then the ratio is significantly less. So basically, the negative performance stats will be amplified in places with sort of a lower base value of property. So that's what we're doing. We're working on all of these challenges this year. Specifically, we're working on sort of data integrity and quality upgrades. That'll be within the next few months. We're trying to make the model available via an API so that people will be able to just get predictions directly from the model. If they say have an additional bedroom, they could just get the estimate right from it. We're also working on a condominium model. So basically taking this same framework, transferring it to value condominiums. And then in the near future, we have some more improvements, mostly around sort of spatial data and model tuning, more data integrity improvements, but then also automated sort of reporting. Far, far future, we might crowdsource sort of information, live train the model, maybe even have some sort of built-in mechanisms for the model to capture black swan events like 2008, things like that. So that's where we're at. We've significantly improved our performance from 2018 for the City Tri. We've implemented an entirely new, very cutting edge framework using basically the latest technologies available. If you are interested in contributing to that, all the code, as I mentioned, is available on GitLab. You can see it at this link. Feel free to go there now. We welcome pull requests. So if you have some feature that you're thinking about, feel free to add us. Replication data is not available quite yet, but will be soon on the Cook County Data Portal. And so we hope that people will use our model and the replication data to rerun, even maybe try to improve what we've already done. And also we are hiring. So they may not be posted yet, but the data science department will be posting junior level positions in the near future. So keep your eye on this link. However, please do not contact us directly. It is not allowed. All right, and I will take questions.
Great. Thank you for that, Dan. And just a reminder to our audience that our code of conduct still does apply. So although we are virtual, the code of conduct we had at Shohack Night in person is still the same for our virtual events. But yeah, I assume we do have a good amount of questions already from the audience here. So I will take the first one. So the last time the assessor spoke to Shohack Night, he at the time stated that the system would be more accurate than under the previous assessors. Yet the last time my Schaumburg home was assessed, I hired a firm to appeal the assessment and they were successful. So how soon before can someone expect to no longer have to appeal their assessments, since that is money out of their pocket?
Rob, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. So some background statistics, right? So Cook County leads the country in the number of appeals. We and it's so vastly out of proportion. So in 2019, we had 100,000 appeals of just the triennial residential assessments. I think we topped out just under 200,000 appeals in total, which is for 100,000 appeals, it's like 20% of the our appeals rate is like 40% of triennial residential reassessments, and our win rate was like 30 something percent. Every other county in the United States, if they top an appeals rate of 7% of their tax base, they start to sweat, because that for them is like a huge load, right? So you might think, well, maybe that's because Cook County has the worst performance stats. Not even close. Not even close. Nationally, we're middling. We were middling. Now, and then in 2019, our performance stats were pretty darn good. We hit the IAAO standard in all but one township, one or two. Can't remember off the top of my head, but so it's like the number of appeals is way out of proportion to the quality of our assessment in proportion to all other assessors' offices in the world. So why is this, right? It could be that there are a lot of potential explanations. One explanation is that there's a culture of appealing in Cook County that has arisen and been fostered by low quality assessments in the past and interest groups that make a lot of money off of assessments. So just on the residential side, in previous years, I've estimated that the industry is roughly worth $50 million a year. And that's just residential assessments, right? The commercial stuff is big bucks. Mm-hmm. And so there's this sort of like perpetuation of the argument that you should appeal, and if you don't appeal, you're a sucker. And we've sort of reached this new equilibrium where that's to some degree makes sense. Because if your neighbor appeals and wins, then you're going to pick up their share of the levy, right? And so this year, our office is making a concerted effort to look at how our office processes appeals and how our office creates an institutional framework that encourages that type of culture of appeal. Ultimately, we want to get to the point where appealing is not necessary to receive a fair assessment, and appealing, if you appeal and you have a fair assessment, you will not win your appeal. And the second one is important, right? Because even if you have a fair assessment, if we're granting appeals to a large portion of the residential tax base, it still makes sense for you to appeal. You don't want to be holding their remaining tax bill. And so it's very important that if you appeal and you have a fair assessment that you're appealing, that you don't win. And if you don't have a fair, that would allow the people who don't have fair assessments to get more of our office's attention, right? Because there's a subset of properties where obviously we don't do a perfect job on, and we want to hear from those people, but they're right now drowned out by all the people, who are within 5% of their sale price, and they think this is unfair.
Mm-hmm. Josh, you went to the next one?
Yeah, definitely. So the next question is the model for a single family home different than for a condo? What condo features are tracked?
I can take that one. So the model will use many of the same features. The main difference between the residential and the condominium model is that the condominium model has no internal characteristics of the property at all. We have no identifiable characteristics of the interior of condominiums. So all of the value is basically driven by location, time, economic factors, and then also other sales in the building. That's the main difference for condos. We also use other sales, historic sales in the building as a feature in the model. Historically, the condominium model has actually performed quite well, though. It's basically, condos are much more homogeneous than single family properties, so their prices just don't tend to vary quite as much.
The market also does a lot of the heavy lifting for us, right? So if you think about single family homes along a block in Chicago, it's it's perfectly normal to see $1 million home next to a $300,000 home. That in many neighborhoods this is not unusual at all. In condominium buildings, that would be very unusual, because condominium developers, when they build buildings, they try to build buildings for a target market. Typically, unfortunately, in American society, you would not be. It would not be a good strategy for long-term stability of condominiums associations if you attempted to create a condominium building that mirrored the income distribution in society, right? So you're like, okay, we have a 2-story penthouse on the top, and then we have a 1-bedroom on the bottom that we're going to have a very large family in. Those 2 families, they will not get along. So the market sort of like collects up homogeneous groups of condominiums and bundles them together in buildings. And so by looking at the variance across buildings, the variance across buildings is much larger than the variance within buildings. And so what we can do is we can leverage the fact that these buildings cluster similar units together to get a lot of traction. Our IAAO stats on condos are really good.
So why use both FEMA and First Street flood models?
Oh, good question. So the FEMA model, or the FEMA feature, is basically an indicator. It's basically whether or not you are or are not in the floodplain. The First Street data is a little bit more accurate, so it's graduated. It's basically a flood risk factor 1 through 10. And then there's also a risk direction, which is basically the change in your risk in the next 50 years, increase or decrease. So the First Street data is just a little bit more detailed. We could potentially kick the FEMA data out at this point. There's not too much harm in leaving it in. We'll have to play with it a little bit more. The flood data is not super impactful for the vast majority of properties, although it is in some areas.
There's also like an economic explanation. If you're on a FEMA floodplain, most banks require you to carry flood insurance, which is an additional cost. Regardless of whether you ever actually flood, you're going to be paying for flood insurance, right? So just from an asset standpoint, that the present value of that liability stream is going to be factored into your asset value. But because FEMA floodplains are actually about insurance markets, they actually don't track like real world flooding particularly well, which is the First Street. The First Street Foundation like exists to create a set of maps across the entire United States that's informed by GIS data, but they also have hydrologists, they also have civil engineers that inform these maps. And the purpose of the map is just to get flood risk, not necessarily to create stable insurance markets. And so you end up with like, if you imagine the economic reason, the FEMA floodplain says, what's the impact of your property value of requiring a certain type of insurance? And then the First Street's like, and what's the impact on your property value of actually being at risk of flood?
So many neighborhoods are in the flight path of O'Hare, and last year they were skipped when adjustments were made. What are the metrics to determine if an assessment is lowered due to noise?
There is a O'Hare noise indicator in the model, which basically tracks with the flight paths and boundaries of the airport. So it's basically just a buffered zone around the airport.
Buffered around the flight paths.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we actually didn't skip them. We evaluated the argument. We ran models with and without this O'Hare buffer, and we created a set of buffers and tested them. We did not find a statistically significant effect. If you think about the way the O'Hare noise works, and you think about the way spatial statistics works, we already account for spatial effects in the model through various methods. Last year, we were using neighborhood. We were also using a location factor, which is the smoothing gradient across the entire geography. And you would not expect an area effect to add explanatory value to the model if its boundaries were coterminous with the current neighborhood boundaries, right? And so because O'Hare noise doesn't have a defined irregular boundary that is discontinuous with our current geographies, it's the O'Hare noise is already accounted for by our existing spatial features, but we did explicitly test it to confirm that is the case. And it's always available to the model, the O'Hare buffer. So when we come back around, if that adds explanatory value, the model will pick that up. Thank you, machine learning. And if it doesn't, then the model will discount the impact of that variable, but we have it.
So we do have a few minutes left. So this may be either the last question or second to last, but in what ways does your team reflect the socioeconomic diversity of Cook County?
I should answer that. So we, Sam's distracting me. So sorry, I'm getting these chats from my other teammates who are watching, which is distracting. So basically, what we've done over the last year is put together what we call a leadership pipeline. The problem of underrepresentation of women and minorities, especially in the technology sector, is shared by a lot of different private sectors, right? So you've got banking and finance, which is notoriously white broke culture and stuff like that. And in many ways, this problem is partly due to the fact that these institutions don't actively recruit a diverse workforce. But part of it's also that the pipeline, there are pipelines that are set up that funnel a predominantly male, white male sort of workforce towards these institutions. So the first thing that we've done is we've created and are building robust internship programs. So we have all paid interns. We have master students from UIC and University of Chicago, which is a very diverse range of students in terms of both ethnicity, gender, and national origin. We are this summer piloting a program with Bryn Mawr College to have 2 interns who are funded specifically from a grant that Bryn Mawr has to help to promote women in technology. So the recipient of the grant has to be a female student and has to be interested in studying technology. And so over the summer, we're going to have 2 interns, 1 or 2 interns paid for that foundation. And so that's sort of what we're doing to increase the diversity of our candidate stream, right? Because I can't hire someone who's not a white male if the only people who apply to my jobs are white men. And so we need diverse candidates, and we need them. And frankly, we would love to have those people go off into a different industry as well and bring diversity to that workplace. The second thing is we need a leadership pipeline. So we need to have a way to bring people into the organization intentionally, bring that diverse workforce into the organization, and then have them rise through the organization, right? Because we want these people in positions of leadership. So if we recruit a diverse workforce, but only promote an undiverse group, then we end up with a lack of diversity at the top, and frankly, possibly a lack of value of diversity. And so the leadership pipeline is absolutely critical to that. And the third thing is we need to make sure that we actively recruit candidates from communities that are typically ignored, right? So look, it's easy to go to UChicago. Okay, it's if I want to be lazy, I go to UChicago, I go to Northwestern. I know I'm going to get a really good applicant pool, but it may not be very diverse, right? I want to go to city colleges, right? I want to go to Roosevelt University. I want to actively go to these colleges where maybe, and this isn't a knock against those institutions, but maybe the applicant pool that I get is a little bit more. Some of the applicants are just not qualified, but the trade-off is that I'm going to get a more diverse applicant pool. So those are the 3 things that I've tried to do in order to build our department up as a more diverse culture. And I'm also always open to suggestions because, unfortunately I had a hiring sequence last year and every one of my applicants was a white man. At that point, I'm very limited in the options in terms of diversity because I have an applicant pool that is monochromatic. So those are the kinds of things that I've been doing.
Thank you for that, Rob. So that was the final question for the evening, but I think we have several more. And so sorry, everyone, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but Dan, Robert, do you plan on sticking around for our post live stream Zoom afterwards?
Yeah,
Okay, great.
definitely.
Yeah, so maybe there's an opportunity for some of these other questions to get answered then. But thank you, everyone. This was a really great presentation, super interesting. I learned a lot. I know, Josh, you probably learned some stuff too, but we do have the post live stream Zoom still. So that is starting technically 2 minutes ago. So we're gonna hop off this Zoom and then hop into that other Zoom. The link is gonna be posted in the Hack Night Remote Slack channel, so you can find it there. And other than that, thank you. Dan, thank you, Robert. And I guess the final words, Josh?
Go forth and hack.